The week my family decided I was losing my mind was the same week I quietly took control of everything they thought they were about to inherit. My name is Eleanor Howard. I'm 72 years old, and according to my son Michael, my daughter Rachel, and my daughter-in-law Jennifer, I was becoming forgetful, confused, and incapable of managing my own affairs. They watched me misplace my reading glasses. They whispered when I repeated a question. They exchanged worried looks when I paused before answering. What they didn't know was that every single day that week I was moving assets, signing legal documents, and protecting the legacy my late husband and I had spent 45 years building. And by the time they made their move against me, it was already too late. Before I tell you what happened, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever felt underestimated by your own family? Let me know in the comments. And if you're watching from somewhere in the world tonight, tell me your city and time. Stories like this remind us we're never as alone as we think. If you enjoy real-life family dramas with meaningful lessons, don't forget to like and subscribe so we can continue this conversation together. 2 years before my family decided I was losing my mind, I lost the person who had been my anchor for nearly half a century. My husband, Robert Howard, passed away on a quiet October morning in Columbus, Ohio. 45 years. That was how long we had been married. 45 years of building a life together. 45 years of sacrifices, late nights, business risks, mortgage payments, and dreams that sometimes felt impossible. When people looked at our financial success, they saw the end result. They saw the beautiful house. They saw the investment accounts. They saw the rental properties. They saw the shares Robert owned in a manufacturing company he helped grow from a small regional operation into a thriving business. What they didn't see were the decades behind it. The years when we barely had enough money to buy groceries. The nights Robert worked 2 jobs. The weekends I spent managing our finances at the kitchen table after the children were asleep. Every dollar represented part of our lives. Every asset carried a memory. After Robert died, I felt as if half of my world disappeared overnight. For months, I moved through life in a fog. I still set 2 plates on the table. I still reached for the phone to call him whenever something happened. I still expected to hear his truck pull into the driveway. Grief has a strange way of making a house feel enormous. The silence becomes its own presence. At first, my children seemed genuinely concerned. Michael called almost every day. Rachel visited every weekend. They brought groceries. They checked on me. They offered to help with paperwork. I was grateful. I thought Robert and I had raised compassionate children. Maybe we had. Or maybe grief blinded me to what was happening right in front of me. The first warning sign seemed harmless. One afternoon, Michael was helping me organize documents in my home office. He picked up a folder and casually asked, "Mom, do you still remember all your account passwords?" I laughed. "Of course I do." He smiled. "Just checking." At the time, I thought nothing of it. A few weeks later, Rachel asked a similar question. "Mom, have you updated your will recently?" I looked up from my coffee. "Why?" She shrugged. "Just trying to help." Again, it seemed innocent. Reasonable, even. After all, I was 70 years old. Planning ahead was responsible. But the questions kept coming. Michael wanted to know which bank held the largest investment account. Rachel asked where I stored legal documents. Jennifer became interested in insurance policies. Each question appeared harmless by itself. Together, they began forming a pattern I couldn't quite understand. One Sunday afternoon, the entire family came over for dinner. Jennifer spent most of the evening talking about retirement communities. At first, I thought she was discussing them generally, Then I realized she was looking directly at me. "They have wonderful facilities now," she said. "Private apartments, activities, medical staff." I smiled politely. "I'm not planning to move anywhere." Jennifer exchanged a quick glance with Michael. The moment lasted less than a second, but I noticed it. Something about that look unsettled me. As the months passed, the conversations became more frequent, more focused, more personal. Michael began offering to help manage my finances. Rachel suggested simplifying my investments. Jennifer repeatedly mentioned how stressful financial responsibilities could become at my age. At my age. I started hearing those words more often, as if 72 automatically meant incapable, as if experience suddenly became weakness. One morning, I couldn't find a file containing tax documents. I searched for nearly an hour. Eventually, I discovered it on a shelf where I never stored important papers. I assumed I had misplaced it, but a few weeks later, it happened again. Different file, different location, same feeling. Confusion. Then I noticed other things. Desk drawers slightly open, folders arranged differently, documents shifted, subtle changes, small enough to dismiss, large enough to bother me. I began wondering if someone had been searching through my office. The thought felt ridiculous. Why would my own family snoop through my paperwork? Yet the feeling wouldn't leave. One evening after Michael and Jennifer visited, I walked into my office and immediately knew something was different. Nothing obvious, nothing dramatic, just wrong. I sat in Robert's old leather chair and slowly looked around. Then I found it. A folder containing property records wasn't aligned with the others. Someone had removed it and returned it carelessly. I stared at it for several minutes. A cold feeling settled in my stomach, because suddenly every strange question, every curious conversation, every mention of wills and trusts, every discussion about aging, started fitting together. Not completely, but enough to make me uncomfortable. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying conversations in my head, trying to understand what I was missing. The next morning I made breakfast and sat alone at the kitchen table, the same table where Robert and I had planned our future for decades. I found myself looking at his photograph, a framed picture from our 40th anniversary. He was smiling, confident, steady, the way he always seemed. And for the first time in months, I heard his voice in my memory. Not literally, just something he used to say. Pay attention when people's actions don't match their words. Robert believed actions revealed truth, not promises, not excuses. Actions. I spent the following weeks watching more carefully, listening more carefully, and what I observed disturbed me. Michael and Rachel were asking the same questions, using the same language, making the same suggestions, almost as if they had rehearsed them. That realization hit me harder than anything else, because it meant these weren't random conversations. Someone was coordinating them. Someone had a plan. I simply didn't know what the plan was. Yet, then came the moment that changed everything. A rainy Tuesday afternoon, Rachel had stopped by while I was running errands. She claimed she wanted to drop off soup. When I returned home, her car was gone. The soup sat on the kitchen counter, but something else caught my attention. The printer in my office contained a single sheet of paper. Someone had forgotten to remove it. At first glance, it looked like a legal document. I nearly tossed it away. Then one phrase stopped me cold. Petition for guardianship. I felt my pulse quicken. I read the page again and again. The document wasn't complete. Only part of it had printed, but it was enough. Enough to understand that my fears weren't paranoia. Enough to understand that someone had been exploring legal options. Options that could eventually place my finances, my property, my independence, under someone else's control. I slowly lowered myself into Robert's chair, the paper trembling in my hand. For the first time since his death, I felt truly afraid. Not of aging, not of being alone, but of the people I trusted most. And as I stared at that unfinished document, one terrible question echoed through my mind. How long had this been happening behind my back? I wish I could tell you that the paper I found was a misunderstanding. I wish I could say there was a perfectly innocent explanation for why a partial guardianship document had appeared in my printer. For several days I tried to convince myself that was true. Maybe Rachel had been researching something for a friend. Maybe Michael had printed the wrong document by accident. Maybe I was overreacting. But deep down I knew better. The problem wasn't the paper itself. The problem was that it confirmed what my instincts had been trying to tell me for months. Something was happening behind my back, and the people involved were my own children. For the next 2 weeks, I said nothing. I didn't confront Michael. I didn't ask Rachel any questions. Instead, I watched. I listened. And I paid attention. The more I observed, the more uncomfortable I became. One Saturday afternoon, Michael invited me to lunch. We met at a small restaurant near downtown Columbus. At first, the conversation felt normal. He asked about my garden. He asked whether I had been sleeping well. He talked about work. Then, without warning, the conversation shifted. "Mom," he said carefully, "have you ever thought about simplifying things?" I looked up from my coffee. "What things?" "You know, your finances, the properties, the investments." I smiled. "I'm managing them just fine." He nodded, but something in his expression changed, almost disappointment. "Of course," he said. "I just think it might be easier if someone helped." Someone. Not an advisor, not a professional. Someone. I knew exactly who he meant. I changed the subject, but Michael looked frustrated for the rest of lunch. That alone wouldn't have worried me. What worried me was what happened 3 days later. Rachel came by unexpectedly. She carried a large folder under her arm. After a few minutes of casual conversation, she placed it on the kitchen table. "I brought you something." "What is it?" "Information." I opened the folder. Inside were glossy brochures, photos of beautiful buildings, gardens, dining rooms, activities, senior living communities, assisted living facilities, independent care campuses. My stomach tightened. "Rachel." Her smile faltered. "I just thought you should have options." "Options for what?" She hesitated. "For the future." I closed the folder. "The future isn't here yet." "No, but—" "Rachel." My voice was calm. Too calm. Because inside I felt something breaking. Not anger. Not yet. Sadness. The kind that settles deep inside your chest. The kind that comes when people stop seeing who you are and start seeing who they want you to become. Rachel looked uncomfortable. For a moment she seemed almost guilty. Then she stood. "We're only trying to help." There it was again. The same phrase, the exact same phrase Michael used, as if they were reading from the same script. After she left, I sat alone for a long time, thinking, remembering, trying to understand when everything had changed, because these weren't bad children. At least they hadn't been. Michael had been a loving son for most of his life. Rachel had always been thoughtful, compassionate, kind. So what was happening? What was driving them? I didn't have an answer, but I knew I needed one. A few days later, another incident pushed me closer to the truth. Jennifer invited me to coffee. Unlike Michael and Rachel, she rarely hid her intentions. She believed she was smarter than everyone around her. People like that often reveal more than they realize. We sat in a cafe near her office. For the first 20 minutes, she talked about ordinary things. Then she leaned forward. "Eleanor, can I be honest with you?" I smiled politely. "Of course." "I worry about you." There it was again. Concern. Always concern. Wrapped around something else. "I appreciate that." She lowered her voice. "Michael is worried too." "Interesting." "Not Michael. Michael is worried." A subtle difference. Jennifer was positioning herself as the messenger, the reasonable one, the peacemaker. "We've noticed a few things. She paused, then quickly corrected herself. "I mean Michael and I." I nodded. "What things?" She began listing examples: a forgotten appointment, a misplaced bill, a repeated story, tiny moments, normal moments, moments that happen to almost everyone, especially after losing a spouse. Yet Jennifer spoke as if she were presenting evidence in court, one item after another, carefully organized, methodically documented. And suddenly a realization hit me. These weren't casual observations. Someone had been keeping track, actually keeping track, recording mistakes, collecting examples, building a case. The thought sent a chill through me. I remained calm, but inside alarm bells were ringing. When I returned home, I opened a notebook and began writing down everything I remembered. Every conversation, every strange question, every unusual event, every reference to aging memory or financial control. By midnight, I had filled several pages. Looking at the list was unsettling, because for the first time I could see the pattern clearly. The questions were increasing, the pressure was increasing, and the conversations were becoming more coordinated. 3 days later, I received proof. Pure proof. It happened by accident, or perhaps by carelessness. Michael and Jennifer came over for dinner. Halfway through the evening, Michael received a phone call. He stepped outside to answer it. Jennifer followed him a few minutes later. The kitchen window was open. I wasn't eavesdropping, at least not intentionally, but I couldn't help hearing part of the conversation. Jennifer's voice was sharp, frustrated. "How much longer are we supposed to wait?" Silence. Then Michael answered. "I know." More silence. Then Jennifer again. "If we don't do this soon, she'll change everything." My heart stopped. Everything. Change everything. I remained frozen in my chair, listening, trying to hear more. Unfortunately, a passing truck drowned out the next several sentences. When I heard them again, the conversation was ending. But one final statement reached me clearly. Jennifer said, "Then we need more evidence." Evidence. Not help. Not support. Evidence. That single word confirmed everything I feared. When they returned inside, I acted as though nothing had happened. I smiled. I served dessert. I listened to their stories. Meanwhile, my mind raced. Evidence for what? Guardianship, financial control. Something even bigger. That night I barely slept. The next morning I searched my office again. Carefully. Methodically. This time I examined every drawer, every shelf, every cabinet. Near the back of a filing cabinet tucked between property records, I found something I had never seen before. A printed email. Someone had accidentally left it behind. The subject line made my blood run cold. Potential conservatorship options. I sat down immediately. My hands were shaking. The email wasn't complete, only one page. But it was enough. Enough to reveal that someone had been actively researching legal ways to gain authority over another adult's finances. Enough to reveal that the research wasn't theoretical. Specific details matched my situation, my age, my assets, my circumstances. For several minutes I couldn't breathe. Not because I was surprised anymore, because I finally understood how serious this had become. This wasn't concern. This wasn't family support. This wasn't love expressed awkwardly. This was preparation. Preparation for a legal move. Preparation for a battle I didn't even know I was fighting. I looked around the office Robert and I had shared for years. The office where we built our future. The office where we trusted our children would one day honor our legacy. And for the first time, a terrifying thought entered my mind. What if Michael and Rachel weren't just worried about me? What if they were worried about losing access to what I owned? The answer felt impossible, and yet every piece of evidence pointed in the same direction. I knew then that waiting was no longer an option. If my children were quietly building a case against me, I needed someone on my side. Someone who understood the law. Someone I could trust completely. The next morning, before anyone in my family knew what I was doing, I picked up the phone and called the only person Robert had ever trusted with our legal affairs, Attorney Victoria Bennett. And that phone call would change everything. When I called Attorney Victoria Bennett, I expected reassurance. What I received instead was a warning. Victoria had been Robert's attorney for nearly 20 years. She helped us structure our trust. She handled business agreements. She reviewed our estate plans. Most importantly, she was one of the few people Robert trusted completely. When her receptionist answered, I asked for the first available appointment. An hour later, Victoria herself called me back. "Eleanor?" "Yes." Her voice immediately softened. "How are you doing?" I almost said fine. Instead, I told her the truth. "I think my children may be planning something." Silence. Not shocked silence. Careful silence. The kind lawyers use when they're listening. "Tell me everything." For nearly 40 minutes, I described everything I had observed. The questions, the missing documents, the brochures, the conversations, the printed emails, the partial guardianship paperwork. Victoria interrupted only occasionally, usually to ask for specific dates or details. When I finished, she remained quiet for several seconds. Finally, she said something that made my stomach tighten. "Eleanor, I want you to come see me immediately." "Not next week. Not when convenient. Immediately." The following morning, I drove downtown to her office. The entire trip I tried convincing myself I was overreacting. But the moment Victoria saw my face, I knew she didn't believe that. She led me into a private conference room, closed the door, then spread several legal documents across the table. "What I'm about to explain may be uncomfortable." I nodded. "I've already been uncomfortable for months." A faint smile crossed her face. Then it disappeared. "Eleanor, if someone successfully convinces a court that you're no longer capable of managing your affairs, they can request guardianship or conservatorship." I had heard the terms before, but never paid much attention. Now every word felt important. "What exactly does that mean?" Victoria folded her hands. "It means someone else could potentially make decisions for you." I felt a chill. "What kind of decisions?" "Financial decisions, property decisions, medical decisions, living arrangements. I stared at her. You mean they could decide where I live? In some circumstances, yes. My heart sank. The room suddenly felt smaller, more suffocating. Victoria continued carefully. These legal protections exist for good reasons. They're designed to help people who genuinely cannot care for themselves. But they can also be abused. That single sentence hung heavily between us. I thought about Michael, Rachel, Jennifer. The possibility felt impossible, and yet every piece of evidence kept pointing toward the same conclusion. Victoria opened a file. Eleanor, have you ever been diagnosed with dementia? No. Any cognitive impairment? No. Any neurological condition? No. She nodded. Then the first thing we're going to do is protect you. The certainty in her voice was comforting. For the first time in weeks, I felt less alone. Victoria outlined a strategy. Not aggressive, not confrontational. Protective. Step by step. Legal. Methodical. The same way Robert would have handled a business problem. First, she wanted a complete, independent cognitive evaluation, not from a family friend, not from someone connected to Michael, an independent specialist. Second, she wanted a full review of every estate planning document, trusts, wills, beneficiary designations, property ownership structures, everything. Third, she wanted to identify any vulnerabilities that could be exploited. The word exploited hit hard, because that's exactly how this situation felt. Not concern. Exploitation. When the meeting ended, Victoria handed me a list of appointments. We start immediately. I looked at her. You really think this could become serious? She didn't hesitate. I think it's already serious. The drive home felt different. I wasn't confused anymore. I wasn't guessing. For the first time, I understood the threat, and understanding changed everything. Over the next several days, I followed Victoria's instructions. The cognitive evaluation came first. I spent nearly 4 hours with a neurologist specializing in memory and aging. The testing was extensive. Problem solving, memory exercises, language assessments, reasoning tasks, attention measurements. When it was over, I felt exhausted, but I also felt strangely confident. I knew my mind. I knew who I was. A week later, the results arrived. Victoria called immediately. Eleanor. Yes. You passed every section. I laughed for the first time in days. What does that mean exactly? It means you performed above average for your age group. Relief washed through me, not because I doubted myself, because now I had proof, professional proof, objective proof, proof that no one could easily challenge. The next step involved reviewing our estate structure. That process revealed something important, something I hadn't fully appreciated before. Robert and I had accumulated far more assets than most people realized. The house alone was worth several $1,000,000. The rental properties generated significant income. The investment portfolio had grown steadily for decades. Then there were the business shares. Collectively, the estate represented a lifetime of work, a lifetime of sacrifice, a lifetime of planning. Suddenly, I understood why someone might be tempted, not justified, tempted. Victoria studied every document. Then she looked at me across her desk. Eleanor, I need to ask you something. What? Do your children know the full value of your estate? I thought about it. Not exactly. She nodded slowly. Good. The answer surprised me. Why good? Because people behave differently when they know specific numbers. That statement stayed with me. People behave differently. I was beginning to learn just how true that was. Several days later, something unexpected happened. Michael came to visit. He arrived without calling first, something he rarely did. We sat in the living room drinking coffee. For a while, the conversation felt normal. Then he casually asked a question. "Mom, when was the last time you updated your trust?" Every muscle in my body tightened, not visibly, internally. I forced myself to smile. "Oh, I don't remember." The lie came easier than expected. Michael leaned forward. "You don't remember." I shrugged. "Maybe a few years ago." Another lie. I had reviewed it 3 days earlier. Michael looked thoughtful, interested, encouraged. That reaction told me everything. He wasn't worried that I couldn't remember. He was pleased. The realization hurt more than I expected, because it wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was evidence, emotional evidence. A son who appeared relieved by signs of weakness. That evening I sat alone in my bedroom, thinking, reflecting, and remembering something Robert used to say. "Never show all your cards until you understand the game." I finally understood what he meant. For weeks, I had been reacting emotionally. Now I needed to think strategically. If someone was building a false narrative about my mental decline, arguing with them wouldn't help. Defending myself wouldn't help. They would simply interpret every reaction as further evidence. Victoria understood that immediately. When I shared my concerns, she nodded. "Then stop trying to convince them." "What do you mean? Let them underestimate you?" The suggestion startled me. "You want me to pretend?" "I want you to observe." I thought about that for a long time. Then I slowly smiled. For the first time since this nightmare began, I saw a path forward. A dangerous path, but a workable one. If Michael and Rachel believed I was becoming forgetful, perhaps I didn't need to correct them. Not yet. Perhaps the safest thing I could do was allow them to feel confident. Allow them to think they were ahead. Allow them to underestimate me. Because while they were busy building their case, Victoria and I would be building ours. And before this was over, every assumption they had made about me would become their greatest mistake. The strangest week of my life began on a Monday morning. To everyone around me, it looked ordinary. I watered my flowers. I read the newspaper. I went grocery shopping. I answered a few phone calls. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious. But beneath the surface, every single day of that week was carefully planned. Every appointment mattered. Every signature mattered. Every decision moved me one step closer to protecting everything Robert and I had spent our lives building. And while my family was busy convincing themselves that I was becoming senile, I was quietly moving assets out of reach. Monday began with a meeting at Victoria Bennett's office. The first target was one of our rental properties. Robert and I had purchased it nearly 30 years earlier. At the time, it was little more than a neglected duplex. We renovated it ourselves. Robert handled construction. I handled budgets. Together, we turned it into a profitable investment. The property carried countless memories. I still remembered scraping old paint off the walls beside him, laughing when neither of us knew what we were doing. Now that property would become part of a newly strengthened asset protection trust. The transfer wasn't dramatic, just paperwork, signatures, legal filings, but emotionally it felt significant. I wasn't giving up control, I was securing it, making sure no one could manipulate circumstances to force a sale. As I left Victoria's office, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Relief. That evening, Michael called. His timing was almost amusing. "How was your day, Mom?" "Oh, you know." I deliberately paused, pretending to search for words. "Quiet." Michael sounded pleased. Not concerned. Pleased. I noticed it immediately, and that realization hurt more than I cared to admit. Tuesday focused on beneficiary designations. Most people don't realize how powerful those documents are. Many assets transfer outside a will entirely. Retirement accounts, investment accounts, certain trusts. Victoria reviewed every detail, every name, every contingency, every legal provision. Together, we updated vulnerable sections and strengthened protections. Nothing illegal, nothing deceptive, simply responsible planning. Exactly what any competent adult should do. The irony wasn't lost on me. My children were preparing to argue I couldn't manage my affairs. Meanwhile, I was spending hours making complex financial decisions they wouldn't have understood themselves. That afternoon, Rachel stopped by unexpectedly. She found me sitting at the kitchen table reviewing a magazine. In reality, I had spent the previous 2 hours on a conference call with financial advisors. The documents were already locked away. "Hi, Mom." "Rachel." She sat across from me. For several minutes, she made small talk. Then she asked casually, "Have you had any trouble balancing your checkbook lately?" I nearly laughed. Instead, I frowned slightly. "My checkbook?" "Yes." I pretended to think. "Oh, maybe once or twice." Another lie. I hadn't made an accounting error in decades. Rachel nodded slowly, almost as if she were mentally recording the answer. Then she changed the subject. When she left, I wrote down the entire conversation. Every question, every reaction, every detail. Victoria had advised me to document everything, so I did. Wednesday brought perhaps the most important move of the entire week, the business shares. Robert's shares in the manufacturing company represented a substantial portion of our estate. Not only financially, emotionally. That company had been his life's work. The shares were already protected through existing structures, but Victoria recommended additional safeguards. The process took most of the day. Meetings, signatures, corporate approvals. By evening, the revised structure was complete. The shares would remain secure regardless of any future attempt to challenge my competency. I drove home exhausted, yet deeply satisfied. 3 days. 3 major protections completed, and my family still had no idea. That night, Jennifer called. Unlike Michael and Rachel, she rarely bothered hiding her intentions. "Eleanor, how are you feeling?" "I'm fine." "You sound tired." I smiled to myself. Tired people sound tired. A brief silence followed. Then she asked, "Have you thought any more about getting help around the house?" There it was again. Help. Always help. The word had begun to irritate me, because it never meant assistance. It meant access. Access to my life. Access to my finances. Access to my independence. "I appreciate the concern," Jennifer sighed. "We just want what's best for you." The phrase sounded rehearsed, mechanical, as though she'd repeated it so many times she no longer heard herself saying it. Thursday focused on inventory. One of Victoria's recommendations involved documenting valuable assets, jewelry, artwork, collectibles, family heirlooms. Items often overlooked during estate disputes. A professional team photographed and cataloged everything. Each item received supporting documentation, descriptions, locations, ownership records. The process lasted nearly 6 hours. As I watched them work, I thought about Robert. Many of those items carried stories. The watch he bought after landing his first major contract, the painting we purchased during our 25th anniversary trip, the antique desk that belonged to his grandfather. Objects become symbols over time. They hold pieces of our lives. I wasn't protecting possessions. I was protecting memories. That evening, Michael stopped by, without warning. Again, the frequency of these surprise visits was increasing. He found me organizing family photographs, a genuine activity this time. I intentionally held one picture upside down, a childish trick, but I wanted to see his reaction. Sure enough, he noticed immediately. His eyes lit up, just for a second, a tiny flash of satisfaction. Then he quickly concealed it. "Mom, that's upside down." "Oh." I turned it around. "You're right." Michael smiled, a little too quickly, a little too warmly, as if he had just received confirmation of something. The performance was becoming easier, and that realization disturbed me, because every time they underestimated me, they revealed more about themselves. Friday brought banking updates, fraud alerts, enhanced monitoring, additional security measures, restricted access authorizations, everything Victoria recommended. By then, I understood something important. Protecting assets wasn't about money. Money was simply the tool. The real issue was control. Control over my future. Control over my choices. Control over my dignity. The financial protections ensured that nobody could quietly seize that control from me. Saturday, I met with Victoria again. We reviewed progress. Nearly every major objective had been completed. Only a few final documents remained. She looked pleased. I felt hopeful. Then she asked a question. "Has anyone become more aggressive?" I thought about it. "Yes." She nodded. "That's what I expected." Apparently, people become impatient when plans aren't progressing as quickly as they want, and impatience often leads to mistakes. Sunday completed the final stage. The last documents were signed. The last protections implemented. The last vulnerabilities closed. As I walked out of Victoria's office that afternoon, the work was finished. The trust was updated. The properties were secured. The investments were protected. The business shares were safeguarded. The estate plan was stronger than it had ever been. For the first time in months, I could breathe. But that feeling didn't last long, because later that evening I overheard something that chilled me. Michael and Jennifer were standing on my back patio. They thought I was inside watching television. In reality, I had stepped into the laundry room near the open door. Their voices carried clearly. "We need to move faster," Jennifer said. "I know, she's getting harder to read." Michael sighed. "We'll have help soon." Help. That word again. Only this time it sounded different, more specific, more dangerous. Jennifer lowered her voice. "Do you think Dr. Reed will cooperate?" For a moment, everything inside me went still. Dr. Samuel Reed, a longtime family acquaintance, a physician, someone whose opinion carried weight, someone whose professional assessment could influence a court. Michael answered quietly. "He already agreed to visit." My heart began pounding. Visit? Not because I needed medical care, because they were arranging an evaluation I had not requested, an evaluation designed to support their narrative. I remained frozen in place until the conversation ended. Then I slowly returned to the living room. 7 days. 7 days of protecting myself. 7 days of moving assets. 7 days of quietly staying ahead of them. Yet now it was clear. My family was preparing their next move, and unlike everything that came before, this one involved a doctor. A doctor who might help them convince the world that I could no longer trust my own mind. Fortunately for them, they thought they were about to test a confused old woman. Unfortunately for them, I was already 3 steps ahead. The visit happened 3 days later, Wednesday morning, 10:15, right on schedule. I knew the exact time because Michael called the night before. His voice carried an artificial casualness that immediately put me on alert. "Mom, Dr. Samuel Reed is going to stop by tomorrow." I paused. "Why?" "Oh, nothing serious." Nothing serious. Whenever people say those words, something serious usually follows. Michael continued. "He was asking about you recently." Interesting. A physician who hadn't contacted me in over a year was suddenly asking about me. What does he want? Just checking in. Checking in. Another phrase I had grown tired of hearing. Everything was checking in. Everything was concern. Everything was supposedly for my benefit. I agreed to the visit, not because I trusted their intentions, because I wanted to see what happened next. The following morning I prepared carefully, not for Dr. Reed, for myself. Victoria and I had already discussed the situation extensively. She believed the visit might be an attempt to create documentation regarding my mental state. Not an official evaluation. Not yet. More of a preliminary observation. A fishing expedition. The good news was that my independent neurological assessment was already complete. The signed report sat safely inside Victoria's office. It clearly stated that I was fully competent, mentally sharp, capable of managing complex financial matters. In other words, it completely destroyed the narrative my family appeared to be building. That knowledge gave me confidence. Confidence allowed me to stay calm. At exactly 10:15, the doorbell rang. I opened the door and found Michael standing beside Dr. Samuel Reed. Samuel was in his early 60s. Professional, polished, friendly. He had known our family for years. Not closely, but enough that his presence immediately felt inappropriate. This wasn't a social visit. Everyone knew it. "Eleanor," he smiled warmly. "It's been too long." It has. We exchanged pleasantries and moved into the living room. Michael sat nearby, too nearby, like an observer, or perhaps a witness. The distinction mattered. For nearly 20 minutes, the conversation remained harmless. Samuel asked about my health, my sleep, my daily routine, the weather, my garden, my hobbies. The questions felt ordinary, yet something about them felt rehearsed, structured, intentional. Eventually, the conversation shifted, subtly, but unmistakably. "Eleanor, what year is it?" I almost laughed. Instead, I pretended to think. "Oh, goodness." I smiled sheepishly. "Now you've put me on the spot." Samuel chuckled. Michael watched carefully. I eventually answered correctly. Then came another question. "Who is the current president?" I answered. Another. "What day of the week is it?" I hesitated, deliberately, then answered correctly. The pattern became obvious. These weren't casual questions anymore. This was screening. Informal, perhaps, but screening nonetheless. I glanced toward Michael. His eyes remained fixed on me, watching, evaluating, waiting, The realization was painful, because I wasn't looking at a concerned son. I was looking at someone hoping to confirm a conclusion. Samuel continued, "Have you ever forgotten where you were driving?" "No." "Do you lose track of conversations?" "Sometimes." That answer earned a quick look from Michael. Encouragement. Interest. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. The interview continued for another half hour. By the end, I had intentionally presented myself as slightly distracted. Not impaired, not confused, just forgetful enough to reinforce what they already wanted to believe. The strategy made me uncomfortable, but Victoria had been very clear. Do not reveal your position too early. Let them show their hand. When Samuel finally left, Michael lingered behind. Something about his mood seemed different, lighter, more optimistic, as though the visit had gone well. For him, not for me. After a few minutes, he stood. "I'll call you later." I nodded. The moment the door closed, I reached for my phone. Victoria answered on the second ring. "How did it go?" I described everything, every question, every reaction, every glance exchanged between Samuel and Michael. When I finished, she was quiet. Then she asked a question. "Did Samuel explain why he was there?" "No." "Did you request a medical consultation?" "No." "Did he document anything?" "I don't know." Another pause. "Eleanor, I want you to write everything down immediately." I already planned to. By that point, documenting events had become second nature. The notebook beside my bed was growing thicker every week. Every conversation, every suspicious interaction, every piece of evidence, all carefully recorded. 3 days later, Victoria called unexpectedly. Her tone was different, sharper, more focused. "We may have a problem." My stomach tightened. "What happened?" "I found something." Those 3 words instantly raised my pulse. "What?" "Several months ago, Dr. Reed signed a statement regarding Michael." I frowned. "I don't understand." Victoria explained. Michael had been involved in a legal matter connected to one of his business ventures. Nothing criminal, but complicated. Samuel had provided documentation supporting Michael's position. Not illegal, not improper, but enough to establish a professional connection. A connection stronger than I realized. When Victoria finished speaking, I sat silently, thinking. Because suddenly, Samuel's visit felt even less objective, even less independent, even less trustworthy. "You think he's biased?" Victoria chose her words carefully. "I think it's possible he entered the situation with assumptions." Assumptions? Exactly. The entire problem was built on assumptions. Assumptions about aging, assumptions about grief, assumptions about capability, most importantly, assumptions about me. That weekend brought another uncomfortable development. Rachel visited alone. At first, she seemed nervous, restless, distracted. She wandered through the house while we talked, looking around, observing things. Eventually, she sat beside me. "Mom." "Yes." "Have you thought about getting some additional support?" There it was again. Support. The latest version of help. I looked at her carefully. "Why do you keep asking me that?" Rachel hesitated. For a moment, genuine emotion appeared. Guilt. Then it vanished. "I'm worried about you." I smiled sadly. "No, sweetheart." She looked confused. "What? You're worried about something." The room became very quiet. Rachel lowered her eyes. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she changed the subject. Too quickly, too abruptly. That reaction told me everything. Because people who tell the truth don't usually retreat from simple questions. After she left, I spent the evening thinking about my children. Not their actions, their motives. What could possibly drive them to this point? Money alone didn't feel sufficient. There had to be more. Pressure, fear, desperation. Something. The answer arrived unexpectedly 2 days later. Not directly, just a clue. A small clue. But an important one. Michael accidentally forwarded an email chain to the wrong recipient. Me. The mistake lasted only a few minutes before he recalled the message. Unfortunately for him, I had already read it. Most of the conversation was mundane. Scheduling, business discussions, nothing significant. Then I saw a sentence from Jennifer. One sentence. 8 words. 8 words that changed everything. "We can't keep delaying this any longer." I stared at the screen, reading the line again and again. Delaying what? Why the urgency? Why the pressure? What deadline were they facing? For the first time, I began wondering whether this wasn't simply about inheritance. Maybe something else was happening. Something financial. Something hidden. Something serious enough to push my children into behavior I barely recognized. The question stayed with me all night, and by morning I knew one thing for certain. The guardianship plan wasn't the real story. It was only a symptom. Somewhere beneath all the manipulation, secrecy, and pressure, there was a deeper reason. A reason Michael and Rachel were so desperate to gain control, and I intended to find out exactly what it was. The deeper truth didn't reveal itself all at once. It arrived piece by piece. A missed comment here, a suspicious reaction there, a financial clue that didn't make sense until it connected with another. By then I had stopped asking whether my children were planning something. I already knew they were. The question had become why. What could possibly make Michael and Rachel risk their relationship with me? What could possibly make them pursue legal control over their own mother? I got my first answer from Victoria. A week after Dr. Reed's visit, she called and asked me to come to her office. The moment I arrived, I knew she had found something. Her expression told me before she spoke. "Eleanor, I need to ask you a difficult question." I sat down. "Go ahead." "How much do you know about Michael's business finances?" I frowned. "Not much." That was true. Michael owned a commercial construction company. For years he had projected success. New trucks, new contracts, new office space, expensive vacations, the image of prosperity. I rarely questioned it. Parents want to believe their children are doing well. Victoria opened a folder. Inside were public records, court filings, financial disclosures, business liens. I felt my stomach tighten. What am I looking at? Michael's company has significant debt. The words landed heavily. How significant? Victoria slid several pages toward me. I studied the numbers, then studied them again. The amount was staggering, far larger than I expected, far larger than Michael had ever mentioned. He never told me. I'm not surprised. I leaned back slowly, trying to process what I was seeing. Several loans, multiple creditors, cash flow problems, pending obligations. The company wasn't thriving. It was struggling. Badly. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then Victoria pointed to another document. And that's not all. I looked down. More records, more financial information, this time involving Rachel. My chest tightened. Rachel had always been cautious with money, or so I thought. Apparently, that wasn't true anymore. Over the previous 3 years, she had accumulated substantial personal debt. Credit cards, personal loans, refinancing agreements, everything carefully hidden from the family. I felt sick. Not because of the debt itself. People make mistakes. Life happens. What hurt was the secrecy, the deception. The realization that both of my children were facing financial pressure at exactly the same time. Suddenly, Jennifer's urgency made more sense. So did Michael's impatience. So did Rachel's guilt. The pieces were finally starting to fit together. Victoria folded her hands. Eleanor, I'm not saying this proves their intentions. But financial desperation changes people's judgment. I stared at the papers, thinking about everything that had happened. The questions, the pressure, the attempts to document my mistakes, the guardianship research, the doctor's visit. The timing no longer felt accidental. It felt connected, very connected. That evening I sat alone in Robert's old study. The documents spread across the desk. Outside rain tapped softly against the windows. For hours I simply stared, not at the numbers, at Robert's photograph, the framed picture I kept beside the lamp. Sometimes grief fades into the background. Other times it returns unexpectedly. That night it returned, because more than anything I wished he were there, not to solve the problem, just to share the burden. Robert always saw people clearly, much more clearly than I did. I remembered something from years earlier, a conversation I hadn't thought about in a very long time. Michael had been in his 30s. His construction company was still relatively new. One evening after a family dinner, Robert and I were cleaning the kitchen. Michael had just left. Robert stood quietly at the sink, thinking. Then he said something strange. If Michael ever gets into financial trouble, he'll hide it. I looked up. What makes you say that? He hates looking weak. I laughed. Most people do. Robert shook his head. No, Michael would rather create an illusion than ask for help. At the time, I dismissed the comment. Now, years later, I realized Robert had been right. Painfully right. The next clue arrived unexpectedly. 2 days later, Karen Whitmore visited. Karen was an independent senior care consultant Victoria had recommended. Unlike everyone else in my life, Karen had no agenda, no financial interest, no family connection. She was simply helping document my situation objectively. We spent most of the afternoon talking. At one point, she asked about Jennifer. That surprised me. Why Jennifer? Karen hesitated, then spoke carefully. Because she's often the driving force in the interactions you've described. I thought about that and realized she was right. Jennifer initiated many conversations. Jennifer pushed the hardest. Jennifer seemed the most impatient. Karen nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes the loudest person isn't the one who benefits most. That statement stayed with me. Later that evening, I decided to test something. Not a major test, just an observation. Michael called shortly after dinner. During the conversation, I casually mentioned a fictional problem. I've been thinking about selling one of the rental properties. The silence on the other end was immediate, noticeable. Then Michael spoke. Really? Too quickly, too eagerly. I smiled to myself. Maybe. What made you decide that interesting? Not whether I should. Not whether it was wise. Why now the urgency in his voice was impossible to miss. I shrugged even though he couldn't see me. I'm not sure. For the next 10 minutes, Michael asked question after question. Details, timing, value, potential buyers. The conversation told me more than any investigation could. Because people reveal themselves when they think opportunity is near. After hanging up, I wrote everything down, every word, every reaction, every detail. The following weekend brought the most painful discovery yet. Rachel arrived unexpectedly. Unlike her previous visits, she looked exhausted. Dark circles under her eyes, shoulders slumped, emotionally drained. For a brief moment, I saw my daughter instead of my opponent, and my heart broke, because despite everything, I still loved her. Nothing could change that. We sat together on the porch, watching the sunset, neither of us speaking much. Eventually, she sighed. Mom. Yes. I hope you know we care about you. The statement sounded sincere. Genuinely sincere. That made it worse, because somewhere beneath the manipulation, I believed she meant it. The problem was that love had become tangled with fear. Fear had become tangled with money, and money had become tangled with control. A dangerous combination. I looked at her quietly, then asked a simple question. Rachel, are you in trouble? Her face changed instantly, just for a second, but it was enough. Fear. Raw. Fear. Then it disappeared. No. A lie. I knew it immediately. She knew I knew. Neither of us said anything else. The silence between us felt enormous. When she left, I cried for the first time in months. Not because I felt betrayed, because I finally understood what was happening. Michael wasn't acting out of greed alone. Rachel wasn't acting out of greed alone. They were scared, desperate, cornered, and Jennifer had likely convinced them there was an easy solution. Me, my assets, my estate, my future. The realization didn't excuse their behavior, but it explained it. And explanations are powerful, because once you understand someone's motive, you can predict their next move. By then, one fact had become painfully clear. Michael's debts were growing. Rachel's financial situation was worsening. Jennifer was becoming more aggressive. They couldn't wait much longer, which meant the intervention Victoria had predicted was coming soon. Very soon. And when it arrived, my family would believe they were finally taking control. What they didn't know was that every legal protection was already in place. Every asset was secured. Every conversation was documented. Every assumption they had made about me had been carefully preserved. The trap they thought they were building for me was about to close around them instead. The intervention happened on a Sunday afternoon. Ironically, it began with an invitation to lunch. Rachel called 3 days earlier. Her voice sounded unusually cheerful. Mom, why don't we all get together this weekend? I immediately knew something was coming. Families don't suddenly organize urgent gatherings after months of tension unless they have a purpose. Still, I agreed. Because by then, Victoria and I had been expecting this moment. In fact, we had spent nearly 2 weeks preparing for it. Every document was organized. Every protection was finalized. Every contingency had been considered. The only thing left was to wait for my family to make their move. Sunday arrived cold and gray. By noon, Michael, Jennifer, and Rachel had gathered in my dining room. The atmosphere felt strange from the beginning, too formal, too rehearsed. Nobody seemed interested in lunch. Nobody seemed interested in catching up. They were waiting for something or someone. I noticed a leather portfolio resting beside Jennifer's chair. I noticed Rachel's nervous expression. I noticed Michael avoiding eye contact. The signs were impossible to miss. After we finished eating, Jennifer cleared her throat. There it was. The beginning. "Eleanor," she said softly, "we need to talk." I folded my hands calmly. "About what?" Jennifer exchanged a glance with Michael. Then Rachel. The three of them looked exactly like people preparing for a difficult presentation. Michael finally spoke. "Mom, we're worried about you." The phrase no longer surprised me. I simply nodded. "I know." Rachel leaned forward. "We love you." I smiled sadly. "I know that too." For a brief moment, nobody seemed sure what to say next. Perhaps they expected resistance, anger, confusion. Instead, I gave them none. Jennifer took control. As usual, Eleanor, over the last year, we've noticed several concerning changes. Concerning changes. The formal language immediately caught my attention. Not family language. Prepared language. Document language. She continued. "We've observed memory problems." I remained silent. "Difficulties managing responsibilities." Still silent. "Moments of confusion." Rachel lowered her eyes. Michael stared directly at me, waiting, watching, evaluating. The same way he had during Dr. Reed's visit. Jennifer opened the leather portfolio. My pulse remained steady, because I already knew what was inside. Paperwork, recommendations, proposals, perhaps even legal forms. She removed several documents, carefully arranged them on the table, then slid them toward me. "These are temporary arrangements." Temporary? Interesting choice of word. I glanced down. Financial authority forms, asset management authorizations, medical information releases. Exactly what Victoria predicted. The documents would provide access, not complete control yet, but access. Enough access to begin dismantling everything Robert and I had built. I looked up slowly. Jennifer offered what she probably believed was a comforting smile. "We only want to help." Help. Again. Always help. Michael finally spoke. "You shouldn't have to carry all this responsibility." I studied my son carefully. For the first time, I noticed how exhausted he looked. The strain, the pressure, the desperation. The debt had clearly taken its toll. That realization almost made me feel sorry for him. Almost. Rachel swallowed hard. "We just want you to be safe." Safe. Another carefully selected word. The entire conversation had been built around emotionally powerful language. Safety. Concern. Support. Help. Not once had anyone mentioned control. Not once had anyone mentioned money. Yet money sat quietly underneath every sentence. Like an invisible guest at the table, I allowed several seconds to pass. Then I asked a simple question. One question. The same question Victoria and I had discussed beforehand. A question so simple that nobody expected it. "If this isn't about money..." The room became still. Why did Michael ask about selling the rental property before asking how I was feeling? Silence. Absolute silence. Michael's face changed instantly. Jennifer froze. Rachel looked away. No one answered. Because no one could. The question wasn't complicated. It wasn't aggressive. It simply exposed the contradiction. If concern was the true motivation, financial assets would not dominate every conversation, yet they always had. I watched discomfort spread across the room. Jennifer recovered first. "Eleanor, that's not fair." I nodded. "Perhaps." Then I asked another question. "If this is about my health, why did no one mention my independent neurological evaluation?" That landed even harder, Michael blinked. Rachel stared at me. Jennifer looked genuinely shocked. They hadn't known. Of course they hadn't. Victoria and I had kept it private, carefully, deliberately. Michael frowned. "What evaluation?" I smiled gently. "The one that concluded I am fully competent." No one spoke. The atmosphere shifted immediately, not dramatically, subtly, but unmistakably. For the first time, they realized I wasn't reacting. I was responding. There is a difference, a huge difference, and suddenly they could feel it. Jennifer attempted to regain control. "That doesn't change our concerns." Before I could answer, the doorbell rang. The sound echoed through the house. Everyone looked toward the front entrance. I already knew who it was. Michael did not. Rachel did not. Jennifer certainly did not. I stood slowly. "I'll get that." When I opened the door, Attorney Victoria Bennett stood on my porch carrying a black briefcase. She smiled. "Good afternoon, Eleanor." Perfect timing. Together, we entered the dining room. The expressions on my family's faces were almost worth the months of stress, confusion, concern, panic, especially panic. Victoria greeted everyone politely, then took a seat beside me. Jennifer spoke first. "What is this?" Victoria smiled professionally. "I represent Eleanor Howard." The room went quiet again. Michael stared at me. "You hired a lawyer." I looked directly into his eyes. "No, Michael." I paused. "Your father and I hired her 20 years ago." The distinction mattered. Very much. Victoria opened her briefcase, one document at a time. Carefully, methodically, just as she always did. Then another surprise arrived. A knock at the door. Not the doorbell. A knock. Firm. Professional. I walked to the entrance again. Standing outside was a man I recognized immediately. Kevin Foster. A licensed notary public. The same notary Jennifer had apparently arranged for today's paperwork. His expression looked uncomfortable. Extremely uncomfortable. Why? Because Victoria had already spoken with him, and Kevin had discovered something troubling. Several of the documents Jennifer brought contained disclosures that had not been fully explained. Nothing overtly illegal, but certainly misleading. Enough to make a professional notary very nervous. When Kevin entered the room, Jennifer's confidence visibly cracked. For the first time all afternoon, she looked uncertain. Victoria folded her hands calmly, then spoke. "I think before anyone signs anything today, we should discuss some facts." Michael shifted in his chair. Rachel looked terrified. Jennifer remained silent, and I finally felt something I hadn't experienced since this nightmare began. Peace, because the waiting was over. The pretending was over. The months of whispers, manipulation, assumptions, and secret planning were over. My family believed they had gathered here to take control. Instead, they had unknowingly walked into a room where every assumption they made was about to collapse. And Victoria was only beginning. The room was so quiet I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking. Tick, tick, tick. For months, my family had controlled the narrative. I was forgetful. I was vulnerable. I was declining. I needed help. I needed supervision. I needed someone else to manage my affairs. Now, for the first time, that narrative was about to be tested against facts. Real facts. Documented facts. Verified facts. And facts are much harder to manipulate. Victoria Bennett opened her briefcase and placed a thick folder on the dining room table. No one spoke. Not Michael. Not Rachel. Not Jennifer. Even Kevin Foster, the notary, remained silent. Victoria adjusted her glasses. Then she began. Before any discussion about Eleanor Howard's competency can continue, I believe everyone should review a few important documents. Michael crossed his arms. This isn't necessary. Victoria looked directly at him. It absolutely is. The confidence disappeared from his face. Not completely, but enough. Victoria removed the first document. An independent neurological evaluation. Signed. Certified. Comprehensive. She slid copies across the table. Michael stared at the first page. Rachel leaned forward. Jennifer grabbed her copy immediately. The longer they read, the more uncomfortable they became. The report was clear. There was no ambiguity, no uncertainty, no room for interpretation. Eleanor Howard was mentally competent, fully capable, no signs of dementia, no signs of cognitive impairment, no evidence supporting guardianship or conservatorship. I watched Michael's jaw tighten. Jennifer's expression hardened. Rachel looked devastated. Victoria waited until they finished reading. Then she calmly placed another folder on the table. Next. Michael looked up. What is that? A summary of estate planning actions completed over the last several weeks. The color drained from Jennifer's face. I noticed it immediately because she understood the implications before anyone else. Victoria opened the folder, one document after another, methodical, precise, professional, exactly as planned. The rental properties have been transferred into a strengthened asset protection structure. Silence. The investment accounts have updated beneficiary designations. More silence. The corporate shares have revised ownership protections. Michael stared. The trust has been amended. Rachel lowered her eyes. The banking structures have enhanced security provisions. Jennifer looked stunned. Then came the sentence that changed everything. Furthermore, individuals seeking control of Eleanor's finances have been removed from all decision-making authority. No one moved. No one breathed. No one spoke. Because everyone understood exactly what that meant. Michael finally broke the silence. You removed us. Not angry. Not yet. Shocked. Deeply shocked. I looked at my son. For a moment, I saw the little boy who used to ride his bicycle in our driveway, the teenager who asked Robert for advice, the young man who once hugged me after receiving his first business contract. Then I remembered everything that happened over the past year, and the image faded. I protected myself. The distinction mattered. Victoria nodded. Legally and appropriately. Jennifer leaned forward. This is ridiculous. Victoria remained calm. No, she paused. Attempting to gain financial authority over a competent adult would be ridiculous. Jennifer's face reddened. For the first time, she seemed genuinely angry. The mask of concern was slipping. Good. I wanted everyone to see what had been hidden underneath. Michael stood abruptly. Nobody was trying to take advantage of Mom. Victoria quietly reached into her briefcase again. Then she placed a small digital recorder on the table. The room froze. Every person present immediately recognized what it was. Michael sat back down, slowly, very slowly. Victoria folded her hands. Eleanor documented numerous conversations. Jennifer's eyes widened. Rachel looked horrified. I remained silent. Months earlier, Victoria advised me to preserve evidence whenever legally permitted, so I did. Every conversation wasn't recorded, but enough were. Enough to establish patterns, enough to reveal intentions, enough to expose contradictions. Victoria pressed a button. The recording began. Jennifer's voice filled the room. Clear. Unmistakable. If we don't do this soon, she'll change everything. Silence. Then Michael's voice. I know. Another recording. We need more evidence. Another. She shouldn't be making those decisions herself. Another. We can't keep delaying this any longer. The effect was devastating. Not because the statements were criminal, because they revealed intent, pressure, strategy, planning. Everything they claimed did not exist. Rachel covered her face. Tears filled her eyes. Michael looked trapped. Jennifer looked furious, not ashamed, furious. That difference mattered. Karen Whitmore entered shortly afterward. At Victoria's request, she had waited nearby. When she stepped into the dining room, confusion spread across several faces. Victoria introduced her formally. Karen took a seat, then calmly described her role. Independent consultant, neutral observer, professional documentation specialist. She explained her meetings with me, my daily functioning, my decision-making abilities, my organizational skills, my financial understanding, my memory, my reasoning, everything. Her conclusion matched the neurologist's. I was fully competent, fully aware, fully capable. Then Karen delivered the final blow. Eleanor's behavior during this period appeared intentional. The room became silent again. Michael frowned. What does that mean? Karen looked directly at him. It means several instances described as confusion appeared strategic. Jennifer's eyes widened. Rachel stared at me, and suddenly they understood. Every forgotten detail, every repeated question, every small mistake. Not all of them, but enough. Enough to make them underestimate me. Enough to encourage them to reveal themselves. Enough to expose their assumptions. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Michael looked directly at me. Mom. His voice sounded broken. Did you trick us? I stared at him. The question hurt more than anything else that day, because it revealed how differently we viewed the situation. Trick us. As though protecting myself had been the betrayal. As though the problem wasn't their actions, but my response. I spoke quietly. No, Michael. My voice remained steady. You spent a year trying to prove I couldn't manage my own life. No one interrupted. No one could. I continued. I spent 1 week proving that I could. The truth settled heavily across the room, simple, direct, impossible to argue with. Rachel finally began crying openly. Real tears, not performance, not manipulation. Pain. Genuine pain. I'm sorry, Mom. The words came out barely above a whisper. I believed her. That was the hardest part. I believed her because unlike Jennifer, Rachel looked ashamed. Unlike Jennifer, Rachel looked heartbroken. Unlike Jennifer, Rachel looked like someone who finally understood what she had participated in. Michael remained silent, his eyes fixed on the table, lost, defeated. Jennifer, however, was different. She stood abruptly. "This is insane!" Nobody responded. She looked around the room, searching for support, finding none. Finally, she grabbed her purse. "We're leaving," Victoria spoke before she reached the door. "One more thing." Jennifer stopped. Reluctantly, Victoria opened the final folder, the thickest one, the most important one. Inside were formal legal notices, protective filings, documentation preserving evidence, notifications concerning attempted financial interference. Nothing dramatic, nothing theatrical, just legal reality. The kind reality cannot be argued away. The kind reality built on paper trails and facts. Jennifer stared at the documents. For the first time all afternoon, genuine fear appeared in her eyes. Because she finally understood. This wasn't a family argument anymore. It was documentation, evidence, records, witnesses, professionals. Everything she believed she controlled had disappeared. Michael looked exhausted. Rachel looked shattered. Jennifer looked defeated. And I felt something unexpected. Not victory, not satisfaction, sadness. Profound sadness, because despite everything, these were still my children. This was still my family. This was still the life Robert and I spent decades building. The difference was that now the truth stood in the open. No more whispers, no more secret meetings, no more assumptions, no more pretending. The woman they believed was losing her mind had protected every asset, every document, and every decision. And the people who underestimated her were finally forced to confront a reality they never expected. I had never been the vulnerable person in this story. I had simply been the quietest one. The house felt strangely empty after everyone left. For months I had imagined that moment, the confrontation, the truth, the exposure of everything hidden beneath the surface. Yet when it finally happened, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired, deeply tired, the kind of exhaustion that comes after carrying a burden for far too long. That evening, I sat alone in Robert's favorite chair, the same chair where he used to read financial reports, the same chair where he planned investments, the same chair where he once told me that protecting a family sometimes meant making difficult decisions. At the time, I thought he was talking about business. Now I understood he was talking about life. The next morning, Victoria called. Her voice was calm but purposeful. "There are several updates." I wasn't surprised. After what happened at the house, consequences had become unavoidable, not because I wanted revenge, because actions create consequences whether we want them or not. Victoria explained that the guardianship preparations had effectively collapsed. The independent neurological evaluations alone made any serious attempt extremely unlikely. The recordings made it even worse. The documentation, the witnesses, the timeline. Everything contradicted the narrative Michael and Jennifer had been building. Legally, their position was weak. Very weak. For the first time in months, I felt completely safe. No hidden meetings, no surprise paperwork, no sudden legal maneuver. The threat was over. At least the immediate threat. But emotional wounds heal much more slowly than legal problems. 3 days later, Michael called. I stared at the phone for nearly a minute before answering. "Hello." Silence. Then a sigh. "Mom." His voice sounded different. Not confident. Not defensive. Defeated. "How are you?" The question almost made me laugh. For a year, nobody seemed interested in how I felt, only what I owned. I'm fine. Another silence. Then Michael spoke. I never wanted it to go this far. I closed my eyes. The statement was familiar. People often say that after consequences arrive. Not before. After. What did you want, Michael? The question lingered between us. Several seconds passed. Finally, he answered. I thought I was protecting everyone. I wasn't angry. Oddly enough, I believed him. At least partially. People rarely see themselves as villains. Most convince themselves their actions are necessary, reasonable, justified. Michael had probably done exactly that. The problem was that good intentions cannot justify bad behavior, especially when those intentions become intertwined with desperation. I spoke carefully. You were trying to protect yourself. Silence again. Then another sigh. This one heavier. Because he knew I was right. Neither of us mentioned his debt. We didn't have to. The truth sat between us. Visible. Unavoidable. Before ending the call, he said something unexpected. I'm sorry. Not a dramatic apology, not a perfect apology, just 2 words, simple. Honest. And perhaps the first completely honest words he had spoken to me in months. After we hung up, I cried. Not because everything was fixed, because it wasn't, but because the son I thought I had lost briefly appeared again, the real Michael, buried beneath fear and financial pressure. A week later, Rachel arrived at my front door. Unlike Michael, she didn't call first. When I opened the door, I immediately noticed she had been crying. Her eyes were swollen, her shoulders slumped. She looked exhausted. Eleanor, she whispered. Not Mom. Eleanor. The formality broke my heart. I stepped aside. Come in. We sat in the kitchen for nearly 20 minutes before either of us spoke. Eventually, Rachel began crying again. Real crying. The kind that comes from shame. I should have stopped it. I remained silent. She continued. I knew things were getting wrong. Wrong. Not complicated, not confusing. Wrong. I kept telling myself we were helping. Tears rolled down her cheeks. But every time something felt wrong, I ignored it. I reached across the table and took her hand. For the first time in a very long time, Rachel looked like my daughter again, not an opponent, not a participant in a scheme. My daughter. The little girl who used to sit beside me during thunderstorms, the teenager who borrowed my sweaters, the young woman who cried at her wedding, the daughter I loved. I know. She stared at me. You do. I nodded. That doesn't excuse it. Fresh tears appeared. I know. Then came the hardest conversation of all, because forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. People often confuse them. I don't. Forgiveness heals the heart. Trust must be rebuilt. One choice at a time. One action at a time. One truth at a time. I told Rachel exactly that. She listened quietly. And to her credit, she didn't argue. She didn't ask for immediate forgiveness. She didn't ask for restored access to finances. She didn't ask for anything. She simply accepted responsibility. That mattered more than she realized. Meanwhile, Jennifer reacted very differently. According to Victoria, she spent weeks attempting to justify her actions. Everyone else was responsible. Everyone else misunderstood. Everyone else overreacted. The recordings, the documents, the evidence. None of it seemed to change her perspective. Some people respond to failure with reflection. Others respond with blame. Jennifer chose blame. Eventually, even Michael grew tired of it. Several months later, I learned they had separated. Not entirely because of what happened, but what happened exposed fractures that already existed. Secrets, pressure, financial strain, distrust. The same things that nearly destroyed my relationship with my children. As for Dr. Samuel Reed, the consequences were professional rather than dramatic. Questions were raised regarding his involvement. Questions regarding objectivity. Questions regarding boundaries. Nothing catastrophic occurred, but scrutiny arrived, and scrutiny tends to follow people for a long time. Victoria often reminded me that accountability isn't always loud. Sometimes it's simply being forced to explain your decisions. Repeatedly, under professional review. One afternoon several months after the intervention, Victoria and I met for lunch. The crisis had ended. The legal work was complete. The estate remained secure. Everything Robert and I built was protected. As we finished dessert, Victoria asked a question. "Any regrets?" I thought about it carefully because the answer mattered. Did I regret protecting myself? No. Did I regret documenting everything? No. Did I regret confronting the truth? No. The only thing I regretted was that it became necessary. I wish my children had trusted me. Victoria nodded. I know. I looked out the restaurant window, watching people walk along the sidewalk, living ordinary lives, facing ordinary problems. Then I thought about something else. A lesson I had learned through all of this. Growing older doesn't make you invisible. It doesn't make your judgment worthless. It doesn't make your experience irrelevant. And it certainly doesn't require surrendering your independence. Too many people assume age automatically equals weakness. My family made that mistake. A very expensive mistake. Because while they were focused on my age, they forgot something important. Experience is a form of strength, and a woman who has spent 45 years building a life doesn't suddenly forget how to protect it. By the end of that year, the legal battles were over. The financial threats were gone. The manipulation had been exposed. Justice, in its quiet way, had arrived. But one final decision remained. A decision that would determine whether my family's future ended in permanent division or the possibility of healing. And that decision would change the next chapter of my life completely. 6 months after the intervention, I stood in my backyard watching the sun rise over Columbus. The air was cool. The grass sparkled with morning dew. And for the first time in nearly 2 years, I felt something that had become unfamiliar. Peace. Real peace. Not the temporary relief that follows a victory, not the calm that comes after a crisis. The deeper kind. The kind that settles into your soul when you finally stop waiting for the next disaster. The house felt different now, lighter. Not because anything had changed physically. The same furniture remained. The same photographs decorated the walls. The same memories lived in every room. The difference was emotional. The fear was gone. The suspicion was gone. The constant pressure was gone. For months, I had been living as though I were defending a fortress. Now, I could simply live. One morning, as I sat drinking coffee in Robert's favorite mug, I found myself thinking about something Victoria once said. Protection is only the first step. At the time, I thought she meant legal protection, asset protection, financial protection. What she actually meant was emotional protection, because surviving betrayal is one thing, Learning how to live afterward is something else entirely. During those 6 months, Rachel and I slowly began rebuilding our relationship. Very slowly. There were no dramatic reconciliations, no movie-style speeches, no magical return to normal. Real healing rarely works that way. Instead, it happened through small moments. One phone call, one honest conversation, one visit at a time. At first, Rachel simply checked in. Not about finances, not about documents, not about trusts, just about me. How was I sleeping? How was my garden? Had I tried the new bakery she mentioned? Simple things, normal things. For a while, that was enough. Trust returns in drops, not floods. One afternoon, she joined me for lunch. Halfway through the meal, she became quiet. Then she looked at me. I still feel ashamed. I set down my fork. I know. Tears filled her eyes. I don't know how I let it happen. I understood that feeling. Sometimes people don't become part of something wrong because they're cruel. They become part of it one compromise at a time, one justification at a time, one bad decision at a time. Eventually, they wake up and barely recognize themselves. Rachel had reached that point. The important thing was that she finally saw it, and seeing it meant she could change. Michael's journey looked very different. For several months, he kept his distance, partly because of embarrassment, partly because of pride, mostly because he was trying to rebuild his life. The debt problems didn't disappear simply because our conflict ended. Reality remained. Creditors remained. Business challenges remained. For the first time in years, Michael was forced to confront those problems honestly, without shortcuts, without fantasies, without expecting someone else to solve them. One evening, he called unexpectedly. We talked for nearly an hour. Not about money, not about the past, about life, about Robert, about mistakes, about responsibility. At one point, he said something I'll never forget. Dad would have been disappointed in me. The statement broke my heart, because it was true, but it was also proof of growth. People rarely change until they stop defending themselves. For the first time, Michael had stopped defending himself. That mattered. A lot. Although our relationship remained more distant than before, it slowly became more honest. And honesty is a stronger foundation than denial. As for Jennifer, she eventually disappeared from our lives almost completely. The separation from Michael became permanent. I won't pretend I celebrated it. Divorce is painful, even when it becomes necessary. But sometimes people reveal who they are during difficult moments. Jennifer certainly did. And once those truths become visible, it's difficult to pretend they aren't there. Meanwhile, I found myself drawn towards something unexpected, helping other seniors. It started accidentally. Victoria invited me to speak at a small community event focused on elder financial abuse. I almost declined. Public speaking had never been my favorite activity, but she insisted. Eleanor, people need to hear your story. So I agreed. The room contained about 40 people, mostly retirees, mostly women, many living alone. As I shared my experience, I noticed something surprising. Heads nodding, eyes widening, people recognizing pieces of their own lives. Afterward, several attendees approached me. One woman confessed that her nephew had pressured her to sign financial documents. Another described constant attempts to gain access to her accounts. A third admitted she felt invisible because everyone treated her age as proof of incompetence. Their stories were different, yet painfully similar. That event changed something inside me. For years, Robert and I had focused on building financial security. Now I wanted to use that security to help others. Several months later, I established the Robert Howard Senior Independence Fund, named in honor of the man who spent his life teaching me the value of preparation. The fund supported legal education programs for older adults. Nothing enormous, nothing flashy, just practical help, information, resources, protection. The kinds of things I wished more people understood. When I signed the final paperwork, I felt Robert's presence more strongly than I had in years. Not literally, but emotionally, as though the values we built together were continuing beyond us. One afternoon, nearly a year after everything began, I visited his grave. I brought fresh flowers, sat quietly beside the headstone, and talked to him, something I still do occasionally. I told him about the fund, about Rachel, about Michael, about everything that happened. Then I laughed softly, because I could almost hear his response, a calm observation, a practical solution, a reminder to focus on what matters. Before leaving, I touched the stone gently and realized something important. The true legacy Robert and I built was never money, never property, never investments. Those things mattered, but they weren't the legacy. The legacy was wisdom, integrity, independence, the courage to protect what is right, even when the people challenging it are the ones you love. As I drove home that afternoon, I felt grateful, not for the betrayal, not for the conflict, but for the lessons, because the experience taught me something valuable. Age does not erase strength. Grief does not erase intelligence, and kindness does not require surrender. The people who underestimated me believed they were dealing with a vulnerable old woman. What they forgot was that I had spent 45 years building a life solving problems, raising a family, and overcoming obstacles. Experience doesn't disappear with age, it accumulates. And sometimes that experience becomes the most powerful asset of all. Today, when I walk through my home, I no longer see a battlefield. I see a life. A good life. A hard-earned life. A life that remains mine. And every morning when the sun rises over Columbus, Ohio, I remember something that carried me through the darkest days of this journey. Never confuse growing older with growing weaker, because those are not the same thing. Not even close. Every family has moments of disagreement, but there is a difference between helping someone and trying to control them. One of the hardest lessons I learned is that love without respect can slowly become manipulation. Good intentions do not excuse bad actions, and fear does not justify taking away another person's dignity. Growing older does not mean losing your value. It does not mean surrendering your independence, your voice, or your right to make decisions about your own life. Too often, society assumes that age automatically means weakness. The truth is that many older adults carry decades of wisdom, resilience, and experience that cannot be measured by a number. If this story teaches anything, it is the importance of protecting yourself while keeping your heart open. Forgiveness can heal relationships, but healthy boundaries protect them. Trust should never be given blindly, and self-respect should never be sacrificed to keep others comfortable. Most importantly, never underestimate a woman who spent her entire life building something meaningful. The same strength that helped her create it may also help her protect it. Now I'd love to hear from you. What would you have done if you were in Eleanor's situation? Have you ever experienced family pressure, financial manipulation, or being underestimated because of your age? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're watching from somewhere in the world today, tell us your city, state, or country and what time it is there. I always enjoy seeing where everyone is joining from. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more powerful family dramas with meaningful life lessons, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join our community. Thank you for spending your time with me today.